I want to also acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, on unceded land, and pay my respects to Ngunnawal and Ngambri ancestors and their descendants. I'm going old school today because in 2020, you just do not push your luck, especially on disrupted sleep. So I'm going old school with the paper this evening. But thank you so much to all the organizers. It's been a really enlightening series of talks so far. So how is the Blue Pacific relevant to a safer, cleaner, fairer future? How many people here have been to the Pacific, to a Pacific island? Put your hand up. Interesting. How many people went on a holiday? Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if it was a great holiday. Excellent. So the Pacific is indeed filled with many, many white sandy beaches, swaying coconut palm trees, pineapple cocktails, and brilliant blue ocean surf. But just behind such scenes are deep histories of environmental and social devastation tied to colonial and imperial expansion and the deliberate transformation of Pacific Island environments. The COVID-19 pandemic has seriously disrupted the international tourism that many Pacific economies rely on, but it's also opened up spaces for reflection and the rethinking of possibilities for new and ancient approaches to social and economic resilience. According to the Pacific Islands Forum leaders, the Blue Pacific is an expression of our region as one big blue continent. It includes all people in an ocean of islands who recognize their needs and potential, who plan and own their development, and who act collectively for the good of all rather than for just a few. The Blue Pacific is a reimagination of a space once seen as small. It actually covers 1/3 of our entire planet. You can fit all the Earth's lands into the Pacific and still have space for another continent. The world's oceans cover 70% of the planet and function as a critical regulator of the Earth's temperature, absorbing the sun's heat, transferring it to the atmosphere, and distributing it around the world. All this drives global weather patterns and acts like a big reverse cycle air conditioner, providing heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. Through photosynthesis, microscopic oceanic life provides about half the world's oxygen. Our oceans are an absolutely critical organ in the body of the planet, and if they're not working properly, the whole system starts to break down. The Pacific Ocean is a major part of that system, and our leaders agree that climate change is the biggest challenge facing our islands. Unfortunately, the ocean and the islands they surround are not always valued for this critical role. The Pacific, particularly when viewed from the rim and from rim countries like Australia, is often seen to be more important from an economic and geostrategic perspective. It's a place to battle for influence. The islands and their peoples are regularly framed as small, underdeveloped, and in constant need of studying, aiding, and saving. The politics often overshadow the critical and urgent environmental issues. And these urgent issues are not solved by science alone. For centuries, the Pacific has been imagined as the perfect lab for understanding human and environmental change and resilience. But like in most labs, the test subjects don't really have a voice or a choice. From nuclear testing programs and other major military exercises to deforestation and mining, the Pacific has often been the site of sacrifice for science, business, and security projects, described as for the good of mankind. This so-called mankind are almost always wealthier producers and consumers beyond the very resource-rich islands and oceans. Today, the Pacific Islands, and particularly our low-lying atolls, are experiencing the effects of global warming and extreme weather in more intense and frequent ways. Salt water is inundating coastal areas and freshwater systems, threatening the physical food security of communities. The Pacific contributes the least to global fossil fuel emissions and global warming, while disproportionately feeling its greatest effects. When the oceans absorb more heat and excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, this changes water temperature and pH levels, causing ocean acidification and deoxygenation. This affects ocean circulation and chemistry and depletes the diversity and abundance of marine life. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that the ocean has absorbed so much atmospheric heat that changes in temperature can now be felt and observed as far as 1,000 meters below the surface. They predict the sea levels will rise to at least 0.4 meters and at perhaps as much as 0.6 meters if we do not drastically lower fossil fuel emissions and keep temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. For many Pacific atolls that are just around 2 meters above sea level, this is huge. Climate change is at the forefront of the Blue Pacific strategy, and Pacific leaders have been calling for global climate action for over 30 years. In spite of a widely accepted frame that sees the Pacific as small and vulnerable, there are many important campaigns run by smart, proud young islanders, such as the Pacific Climate Warriors, working at all levels to bring awareness for the need for integrated global action. Such action, however, must build on a diverse base of knowledge and values, including those of Pacific peoples. The Pacific, meaning peaceful, was named by explorer Ferdinand Magellan in the 1500s. But Pacific Islanders had their own terms for the ocean, such as Tasi, Moana, Wasa Wasa, and Marawa. These terms included a value for kinship, understanding, care, and stewardship. Last year, I participated in a human rights forum with business and legal experts gathered in Melbourne. There was a huge amount of discussion on finding solutions to support ethical business practices and ensure human rights were upheld. The problem I kept seeing was that human rights regularly appeared to be divorced from Indigenous and environmental rights. When asked about my views on how to find balance, I said, "What you do to the land and the sea, you do to the people." For thousands of years, Pacific people were of the land and sea, not apart from it. Land, ocean, sky, and people were in kinship in one holistic complex. I descend from two islands in the Central Pacific, Tabiteueuan in the southern part of Kiribati and Banaba in the west. I was born and raised in Fiji, but these are my ancestral islands. The word for land is Teaiwa, and Kain Teaiwa are the people of the land. This concept of land or place is inclusive of everything, including our waterways. It is similar to concepts such as Vanua in Fiji, Aina in Hawaii, Fonua in Tonga, and Whenua in Aotearoa, New Zealand. While Pacific Islanders were master wayfinders traveling thousands of years before Magellan, they were also brilliant in establishing routes and connecting to new lands and environments. Our ancestors' spirits and deities emerged from oceans, skies, clouds, rocks, turtles, stingrays, spiders, and coconut trees. A system of life evolved where you did your best to ensure you didn't damage or exhaust these things. I have spent 20 years trying to understand what happened on Banaba and why it's in the dilapidated state it's in today. I'll share a little bit of this story. In 1900, New Zealander Albert Ellis was sent on a prospecting mission by a mining company based in London, Sydney, and Auckland. He knew that Nauru was made of phosphate, but Nauru had been claimed by Germany. So he looked for the closest island on the map and found what Europeans had named Ocean Island, which is also called Banaba by the indigenous people. It was 2.5 square miles or 6 square kilometers near the equator and almost completely made of sedimented guano and marine phosphate. Ellis and his colleagues arrived, rifles in hand, you know, just in case, and were welcomed by many bemused Banabans. He tested the rocks, and they turned out to be some of the world's richest sources of phosphoric acid, a key ingredient in phosphate fertilizer that was set along with nitrogen-based fertilizers to power the expansion of global agriculture. Ellis wrote in his journal, "If Ocean Island is what I think it is, there's a fortune in it, if not several." He then asked the Banabans, who had never seen or used money, to lease their land to the company for 999 years for £50 a year. An X was marked on a piece of paper, a British flag planted, and the men started hauling off rocks. This series of events led to the establishment of a lucrative mine that made shareholders very wealthy and resulted in the incorporation of Banaba into the colony. In 1920, Australia, New Zealand, and the British government took over Banaba and Nauru to secure cheap fertilizer for farmers, enhance food security across the 3 countries, and expand other agricultural and shipping supply chains. From 2 tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific, massive fertilizer and farming operations grew and thrived. The impact on the islanders, however, was significant. People went from eating fresh fish, coconut, and pandanus to tinned meat and white bread. They went from dancing and composing new songs about the importance of the land and sea to watching Hollywood films about cowboys on outdoor screens. The company shipped in water from Melbourne, and their officials ate duck, goose, and roasted potatoes. This shiny industrial spot in the middle of the Pacific became a target during World War II, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Banabans and the laborers brought to mine phosphate. The Banabans were then moved to war camps, and after the war to Rambi Island in northern Fiji. My great-grandfather, Tenamo, was one of just 700 Banabans who survived. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Fiji's independence from Great Britain and the 75th anniversary of the Banaban arrival on Rambi. In those 75 years, they have petitioned the UN for independence, placed a small occupying force on their home island, sued the multinational company, sued the British government, received a small out-of-court settlement, lost and rebuilt many aspects of their culture, experienced serious governance issues, and become a small but visible minority in the multicultural nation of Fiji, currently facing major challenges from climate change. The motto of the Rambi Council of Leaders is Atuara Puokira, our God, help us. Several Banabans, including my grand aunt Pelenise Alofa and Isinterunga Rei Paintes, are vocal and widely respected Pacific climate warriors. Mining ceased on Banaba in 1980, and the company packed up and left with no cleaning, clearing, or rehabilitation. 22 million tons of land had been extracted and exported. The island is a mining relic, a post-apocalyptic scene of the end of industrial progress, with a small number of people living amongst the rubble and the old, now overgrown, colonial mansions. A young American journalist, Janice Cantieri, who spent many weeks on Banaba, has highlighted stories of asbestos pollution and many other health challenges facing the small population there. The possibility of reopening the mines continues to be discussed by leaders. Banaba is now everywhere, spread across farmlands, flowing through and polluting other ecosystems. And like their lands, Banabans are also displaced, moving across the seas and transplanted in new soil that we are not indigenous to. Such industrial activities and histories are not separate or different from climate change. Climate change is the culmination of all the effects of all the resource extraction, land desertification and degradation, excessive production and consumption, powered by fossil fuels, and the pollution of lands and waterways by synthetic chemicals. We don't have too many humans on the planet. We have a small number of wealthy humans in industrial countries who consume way more than others and leave a disproportionately massive footprint on the planet. The ocean has always protected Banaba from large-scale intrusion, but not this time. It took hundreds of thousands of years to grow this island and 80 years of mining to devastate it. What islands like Banaba and the Blue Pacific can teach us is how to observe and understand what happens to people and to the planet when you exploit such resources. So what does the Blue Pacific tell us about how to move towards a clean, green, safe, and fair future? There is no STEM-based or technical solution that will be effective or sustainable without the holistic integration of humanities, arts, social sciences, and indigenous thinking, knowledge, and values. How do we move towards a safe, clean, and fair future? By truly supporting justice, equality, and a fair and sustainable distribution of resources. How do we move towards a safe, clean, and fair future? By facing and reckoning with the environmental, political, and social injustices of the past. I do this in my own work by transforming my research into public art exhibitions, because I know not everyone reads academic journals. Philosopher George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Pacific peoples are very familiar with the concept of walking backwards into the future. A Maori proverb goes, "Kia whakatō mure te haere whakamua." I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on my past. How do we move towards a safe, clean, and fair future? By paying serious attention to the blue parts of our planet. If the Earth can be imagined as a body, the Pacific Ocean is a major organ like the lungs, and we all need our lungs to breathe and survive. What we do to the oceans and to the islands, we do to all of us. Thank you.